Welcome back to the How to Podcast series. It's Dave with you yet again. Happy you're here. It's good to be back with you. I did an episode about some tips for hosts of podcasts on how you can treat your guests better and how you can find more guests for your show. All of that was episode 121. This is 122, and now we're going to flip the script. We're going to talk to people who want to be guests on podcasts. And if you are a podcaster, being a guest on another show is a good idea. So this is for you as well, okay? Dual purpose. We're going to help everybody. So some tips from some of my podcasting buddies about podcast guesting and some ideas for you if you want to be a guest on your next podcast right here on the How to Podcast series. Are you ready? Let's get our guesting on. Here we go. So being a podcast guest is a great way to grow your community, your audience, to get in front of people that you don't know and let them get to know you. It's a super way to do that. And so I have some ideas from some of my podcasting friends on things that they have heard or dealt with or learned in the process of working with guests. And also some of my friends that guest on shows that don't have a podcast. I got some of their feedback to share with you, compiled all into this episode, which goes again with episode 121, going back there where you can actually listen to that and get the host perspective. Now we're doing the guest perspective. So have you been a guest on a podcast before? Have you tried it? It's really, really fun. It's really interesting to go on a show and let someone else drive. If you're a podcaster, someone else is running the show and you're just there in the passenger seat. It's a little unnerving when you're used to being the one clicking the buttons and making sure everything works, but it's also quite relaxing because you get to share a different side of you that you might not normally share on your own podcast. So if you're a podcast host, get out there, promote your show by being a guest on other shows. Now I insert my ask. I love having you on my show, on the How to Podcast series, as a guest co-host. Come on, talk about your show, talk about what you're learning in podcasting, and join me right here as a co-host on my show. You can come once, you can come back often, whatever works for you, but I'd love to have you here on the show to share your journey and what you're learning and promote your show. There's the key. Promote your show by being a guest on this show. Think about it, howtopodcast.ca. Let's connect. So some thoughts, some ideas for you around guesting, and here we go. So keep in mind that being a podcast guest on shows, you reach out to a host. Keep in mind that your host might not respond right away, or if sometimes, unfortunately, they may never respond. That's bad. It could be because they're busy. It could be that they're not organized, one of the two. But just realize that putting your name out once might not be enough. Keep sending it. Keep staying in contact. Keep putting your name in front of them. Be on the top of their inbox, especially if you feel like you have something of value to add to their show. Okay? Don't be spammy, but make sure that they know that you're still there. Have one call to action when you go on a podcast. One. Not 25. So I don't need to know about your LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, website, program, counseling opportunities, link to your new book. No. One. And I would suggest that one be your website, not a link tree. A link tree doesn't do anything for you. As far as searchability, it's really hard to find you via a link tree. What is really easy to find is when I find your website, yourname.com. It's very easy. And then on your website, you can have links to everything. And you're like, Dave, but that's expensive. A website can be like $12 a year. It's $1 a month. And then you say, well, Dave, then it's expensive to build a website. Have you heard of Canva? There's a free version of Canva. You can actually build a website for your podcast or for your book or for your business, whatever. And you can start with that. You can always upgrade in the future, but you have one place to send everybody. And all your links to social media are all on one page. Everything you're talking about, one location, one spot, yourname.com. It's really easy at the end of a podcast to be able to do that. So avoid 25 different call to actions. Have one location to send everybody, and that be your website. If you go on podcasts, think about having a gift, a special offer to the listeners of that show, unique to that audience. So it could be a hidden page on your website. It could be an opt-in, a download, a free chapter from your new book, something that only the listeners for this show have access to. It's not something that everyone has access to, just this audience listening to your show. It's a great way to bring them into your world, and they get something free by following your links to wherever you're sending them. A free offer, a free something is always beneficial to an audience. I get this question a lot from people guesting. They say, Dave, do I have to listen to a podcast before I go on it? The short answer is no, you don't really have to. But if you do go on and listen to an episode or two, what happens for you is you get to figure out the tone, the energy, and a little bit about the vibe about the podcast. So if I go on a show and I realize that my host of the show I'm guesting on has a certain pet name for his audience, I'm going to leverage that pet name when I'm talking to his audience. It's like now I'm part of that community as well. So pick up on the little cues that happen from the host to his audience or her audience and leverage that as a guest and enter into the community as one of the community instead of just being an outsider talking to a bunch of strangers on a podcast. Listen, soak it all in, and leverage that when you come on the show. Do you have to listen? No, but you could, and it could make your podcast guesting experience even better. As a podcast host, I get a lot of copy-paste emails that you can tell weren't created just for me. They were just created out of ease, or a VA did it, or an automation tool did it. Something did it, but it's not just for me. So if you use a form that you copy-paste, make sure you tweak it, make sure you make it sound and be appropriate for the host that you're reaching out to. Personalize it, make it real, and don't just copy-paste. Make something stand out in all those emails that we have in our inbox that speaks to me as a host, and I will click on your email before I click on the hundreds of other emails I have that look just like yours. Make it stand out by making it unique. Don't drop the ball on that one. When you pitch yourself to a podcaster, pitch to the podcaster not just that you want to be a guest, but that you have content suggestion for that person's show. I notice that you haven't talked about this on your show. I'm actually an expert in this, and I'd love to come and speak about it to your audience because I notice this is something you haven't talked about often or at all. And I'd love the opportunity to come and share and add content to your podcast. As a podcast host, that is awesome because you're not just coming as a guest, you're coming with an offer of content. And what do I need as a podcast host? Content. I need ideas. And if you come with ideas, that is going to push you up the charts and make you get on the show faster than anyone else who's just there to plug their own thing. So come with content suggestions and the door will open for you as a podcast guest. When you're guesting on a show and your host asks you a question, answer the question and don't make it a 25-minute answer. Make it short. Make it concise. Answer the question in a very unique way. Make sure that you add value in your answer and then stop talking because your host has another question for you. They have something else to come back with, something more. So don't be afraid to keep your answers shorter. Less is always better. And let your host extract from you further details and more information. You don't have to tell them every single thing about the answer. Give them a little bit and let them come back for more. Being a guest on podcasts is a commitment, and in that commitment also comes with having the right tech. So I just met with a potential guest today, and they said, Dave, I love your mic. What are you using? I sent them a link. It's a $50 microphone on Amazon. $50 for a mic and everything you need to plug into your computer to be a better guest. So get a good mic and grab some headphones. It doesn't have to be expensive. If you're going to do one interview in your entire life, you'll probably be okay with getting away with what you have. But if you're going to do more than one, think about investing in your sound. And as well, create a quiet space in your home or wherever you're recording from. Let people know you're recording. Put the animals away. Shut your phone off and be ready for a great interview by creating the space to make a great sounding podcast episode. If you want to sound good, and I'm sure you do, and you want to make big value for your time, then show up with the right tech in a nice quiet space and be ready to be a part of this podcaster's journey and be a guest on their show. I love this advice from a friend who has a podcast. He says to others when he talks about being a guest that he shows up to a podcast as a guest, as if he is now stepping onto the biggest platform that he's ever walked onto, ever in his life, in front of the largest audience he's ever been in front of. And he does that for the smallest show and the largest show. Again, because you don't know who's listening. You don't know when somebody's going to find this episode. So if you show up and you're not really fully engaged, you really aren't showing up with the true you on the episode, you might miss an opportunity now or in the future when someone hears this episode that you might have new connections or someone might find you as a guest on a show, which could open the door to all kinds of amazing opportunities. But you need to show up like a rock star stepping onto stage in front of thousands of screaming fans. That's how you enter a podcast as a guest, not some little bar with one or two people in the crowd. Show up as it's the best opportunity of your life and come to the episode with that mentality and watch what happens as a podcast guest. As a guest on podcast, go through the archive of past guests on the show that you just were on and look into the history of all those guests, and find other guests in your area of expertise. Maybe it's an author that does fiction stories and they're all fantasy based. And you find 3 other authors that came on that same podcast that you were on. And now you can build a relationship with them saying, hey, I was just on Dave's podcast. I noticed you were. I'd love to connect. And now you can build your community by having one thing in common, being on Dave's Living the Next Chapter podcast. Now you can reach out to those other guests, build relationships. You never know where it's going to take you. So go through those episodes and make connections because all of the information's in the show notes, right? So you can then reach out to that guest and say, hey, you and I were both on Dave's podcast. I'd love to meet and chat. Leverage past guests and meet them. And now that you're part of the community on that show. Remember, when you're pitching to a podcast, that your pitch to that show is not about you. It's not all about you. It's about the podcaster and their audience. It's always about the audience. We're doing this for the audience. We're having you on as a guest for the audience. We're not having you on to sell your book, but we want you to bring value. Talk about your journey. Talk about why your book's important, and give us content that we can all enjoy that opens the door for us to go buy your book. Don't just come on and sell the book. We want you to sell you and your story and everything about who you are, and then let us make the decision whether the book is for us or not. Make sure you show up for the audience first, not for yourself as a guest. The other thing I want you to think about is I want you to ask yourself, what is the result that I'm seeking by being a guest on this podcast? Do you even know? Is it just the fact that you want some time on a microphone? Do you have a result, an end game, a reason for why you're doing what you're doing? If you don't, I'm challenging you to figure that out, because that's going to help you frame your answers, frame your time on a podcast, and you're going to know if you're meeting your results by measuring it after the podcast is over. Have I met the expectations of giving my time as a guest? Am I meeting that expectation or not? Because this is your time and you want to make it valuable and you want to make it count. So make sure you have some kind of measuring stick to know that guesting is serving you as a guest. This may seem a little selfish to ask as a podcast host, but I do this when I'm a guest. Make sure you thank your host before, during, and after every time you're on a podcast. Make sure that you make your host look like a star when you're being recorded as a guest on their episode. Don't save it for before they hit record or after they hit stop on the recording, but right in the middle of it, turn the script on your host. And on behalf of their community, become an advocate for the host. Tell them why you love what they do. Thank them for what they do on a regular basis. Tell them about an episode that meant something special to you. You are now speaking to the host of a podcast on behalf of the listeners as a listener of their show. You are now part of their community. You're not just a guest, popping in for an interview and then never to be heard from again. Speak on behalf of the audience who don't have the opportunity to be on the show that you're on. Be the voice of the community that loves that host and leverage that. That is a great way to build relationships with a host and leave them excited to have you back in the future or to promote you as a potential guest on other shows. Overall, if you're going to be a guest on a podcast, be prepared. Again, go back to the tech, be prepared. Go to your content, be prepared. How you show up in a podcast email, be prepared. After the podcast is over, be prepared. As a guest, you want to leverage this opportunity to its utmost highest. And by being prepared, having a plan, and understanding how you fit into all of this will give you great opportunities in the future. And if you want to guest on my show, I'd love to hear from you. And if you want to practice being a guest, I put this out there many times. I've had a few people respond. Thank you for responding. If you're not sure about being a guest on a show and you want some practice, reach out to me, howtopodcast.ca. I would love to come on and just do a Zoom meeting with you. You be the guest, or you be the host, and I'll be the guest, and let's practice so that you get some time on the mic before you jump into doing your first interview or your first hosting of a guest. I'd love to offer that to you. howtopodcast.ca. Reach out, let's chat. And again, if I've missed anything from your perspective on being a guest on a show and some things you've learned, howtopodcast.ca is a great place to reach out. Let me know, and I'd love to update everyone listening on your thoughts on being a guest and how that brings value to you, to the audience, and to the host on the How to Podcast series. Thanks for listening.